In this lesson, we are going to learn how to simplify monomial denominators, which basically is a fancy way of saying that we're going to be adding fractions. The only difference is instead of the adding fractions you've always done in the past, we're actually going to have some variables in there. So the first thing we have to learn is how to find a common denominator, because when we're adding fractions, that's what we need, is a common denominator. Notice that our problem has all monomials in our numerators and denominators, meaning that nothing is being added or subtracted within the fraction. So like that first numerator of 7x, it doesn't say 7 plus x, it just is a 7x. So to find the common denominator for that, we use what we've always done in the past. So we're going to first try and find the common denominator between the numbers 15 and 18. If that's something that you struggle with, there is a way to do that in your calculator. And I want to point out that lots of students right now are thinking that the 15 and 18, the common denominator is 3. Because we're so used to doing common factors that we look for the lowest number that they both divide by. In a common denominator, you're looking for a number that's bigger than both of them that they both divide into. So for example, factors of 15 are 1 and 15, 3, and 5. Those are factors. We're not looking for factors, we're looking for a common denominator. So we're actually looking for multiples of 15, like 15, 30, 45, 60, 75, 90, 105. All the numbers when we were multiplying 15 times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that we would get. Same with 18, 18, 36, and so on. So we're looking for a number bigger than both of those. If you can't find that, I do have on your notes how you could do that on your calculator. So it says to find the least common multiple is what it's called, so the LCM. On your calculator you would go to Math, Number, and then it's 8. And you would punch in 15, 18. Remember, the comma is right above the 7 on your calculator. So look for that, and that can help you. The only thing it doesn't do is if you have 3 numbers, it won't do 3 numbers. So you'd have to pick the biggest 2 numbers and do those 2 and see if the smaller number went into it. And that you might run into every once in a while. But if you punch that in your calculator, you would see that the greatest common multiple, or least common multiple, is 90. So both 15 and 18 divide into 90 evenly. When I'm looking at the variables, you see that I've listed both of our variables that we have here. This one has an x, and so I put the x right here. This one does not have an x. If a variable appears in either denominator, it has to be part of your common denominator. So I have to have an x in my common denominator. Then, when I'm looking at both variables, so notice that this probably have a y squared and a y, between the two, I'm going to use the bigger one. So I'm going to use y squared. And again, it's going to be really hard for us to adjust our thinking on this because when we're doing a greatest common factor, we always use the smallest. But when finding a common denominator, you always pick the biggest. So you might want to make yourself a note on your notes, just so you remember that. So we're always going to pick the biggest. So now you would see that our common denominator, when we put it all together, is 90xy squared. So, knowing that, here's my problem. I'm changing both denominators, you can see below, to say 90xy squared. So this is how you did it in grade school, and we're going to continue with the same thing. We would ask ourselves, what do I multiply 15y squared by, so I'm looking right here at this denominator, to make it become 90xy squared? Well, 15 times 6 is 90, and we'd have to multiply by the x, right? So I'm going to multiply by 6x. If I do that, I would get 90xy squared. See where that comes from? So then I say, well, if I multiply the bottom by 6x, I need to then multiply the top by 6x, because I can't change the fraction's value, I can just change the way it looks. And if I multiply by 6x over 6x, it's the same as multiplying over 1. So now when I multiply that numerator, 6x times 7x, I would get 42x squared. Same idea with the next fraction then. What would I take 18xy times to make it become 90xy squared? Well, hopefully you can see that I'd take it times 5. Why? Because 18 times 5 is 90. I already had the x there, so I didn't have to multiply by any more x's. That x was there already. Nothing changed in the x's. The y's changed, though. It went from a y to a y squared. So I would have had to multiply by a y to make that happen. So if I multiply the denominator by 5y, I multiply the numerator by 5y. which gives me my numerator of 5y squared. Now I have a common denominator. So all that work just got me the common denominator for both, so we can now add our fractions together. Remember, when you're adding fractions, you only add the numerators. The denominators stay the same. So I would take 42x squared plus 5y squared. Those aren't like terms, right? So I actually can't add them. So it seems like we're not doing much work, but we're writing them as one fraction. So my answer is one fraction that says 42x squared plus 5y squared over that common denominator of 5x, or excuse me, 90xy squared. And there's your answer. So let's try that on one more. I want you guys to try this one. So see if you can find the common denominator first. That's the first step I want you to do. And then pause the video, do that, and come back. So hopefully when you found the common denominator, oh, I'm skipping up, you would have found it to be 42a squared b squared. If you're confused on where that came from, the least common multiple between 6 and 14 is 42. And then because there was an a squared in one of the denominators, I had to use that as my common denominator. And then I had the b's as b and b squared, and remember we used the biggest. So I chose b squared. So then I asked myself, when I'm looking at, you'll look at what I multiplied by, 6b times what would make 42a squared b squared? Well, 6 times 7 makes 42. There is no a squared in this denominator right here, so I'd have to multiply by an a squared to make that appear. This is a b to the first, so to make this b to the second, I'd have to multiply by another b. Then I took and multiplied my numerator by the same, so when I took 7a squared b times 5a squared, I got 35a to the fourth b. My other fraction, I had 14a squared b squared. So really the only thing that changed was my number. My variables did not change at all, which means I wouldn't multiply by a variable. 14 times 3 makes 42. So then I just took the numerator times 3, and that's where this 27 came from. So now my answer is just combining them together. Hopefully that made sense to you. That was us adding and subtracting with monomials in there. Next we're going to do binomials and trinomials, so keep an eye out for that.